As we turn our attention towards Anzac Day, I wanted to draw everybody to a new film that is out in cinemas right now. It's called Before Dawn. It's a brand new Australian film that takes a look at a journey of a fictional Western Australian outback kid called Jim Collins, played by Levi Miller in the film. Now, this film is practically everything that we need to remember about Anzac Day. In a very, very special way, I think that this film has been made. This film comes from a great filmmaker, a young great filmmaker here in Australia called Jordan Prince Wright, and this film kind of tells the Anzac story in a sense of a way that we very rarely get to see it depicted on the screen. Now, Jim Collins in this film is a young person who is working on his dad's livestock station, and he's suddenly faced with a dilemma. Does he stay on the station, or does he go with his mates who work on the property as well, off to war? Now, it's interesting because when you go back and look at some of the great Australian films that we've made over the years, films like Breaker Morant, The Light Horseman, when you look at those movies, it kind of celebrates the heroic deeds that we kind of always try to remember during Anzac Day and things like that. But to me, this almost feels like that Red Gum song, I Was Only 19. This feels like the film version of that song because this is a film that kind of celebrates what these guys went through that went off to war to represent Australia, but it doesn't do it in that kind of over-the-top action bravery kind of way that you expect with a film. Like, even if you think of movies like Hacksaw Ridge, I know it's not Australian, there is that epic moment of, wow, this guy is a hero. This film, Before Dawn, feels more like a story that is realistic and depicts what it was like on the front line. Now, I'm not saying that the guys that went to war weren't heroic. They were all heroes in their own sense. But to me, sometimes when we make a movie about the Anzac legend, like I said, movies like Gallipoli and things like that, it's often exaggerated to try and get that point across. And to me, the natural feel of Before Dawn actually gets that across to me a lot more because I could relate to it a lot more. Watching this young guy, Jim, kind of have to make that decision. I mean, he didn't have to go to war. He was probably one of the very few Australians during that period that had a future. He would inherit his dad's livestock property one day. Unlike his mates like Don, like Ed Oxenbould and people like that, he kind of had a future, whereas they're like, I want to go off to war because they were just workers on a farm and they didn't see it as an exciting job or anything that provided them with a future. So he had to make that decision and he saw the pain that it caused his father. And then, of course, they're kind of being sold on the idea by some of his mates that, you know what, the war's almost over. We can go across, have a few weeks of fun. The war is almost over. They were hearing reports that the Australians and the Brits were about to have a huge victory in France, and that was going to end the war. These guys thought they would literally be there for a couple of weeks or a few weeks or a couple of months at the most, and then get to come back with this brave story of being off to war, and that they thought that would make their futures brighter when they got back to Australia. That is very well depicted in this movie. But of course, they get there and they find the war is far from over, and the Western Front is not a great spot to be in. This film, it almost feels like you're watching a diary. There's not epic battle scenes every single day or anything like that. For the most part of this movie, these guys are hiding because they're under fire. They're seeing traumatic things like mortars landing in the trenches and blowing up their friends, things like that. Having to face dilemmas of, this guy is trapped. Do I put myself in danger to go and free him from that fence, or do I leave him there? And like, there's harrowing moments as that discussion comes up and they hear this guy screaming out in pain, but they have to face whether do they go and get them. Then there's the blame game. Oh, you ran off from this. You ran off from my mate before he got shot, kind of thing. There's things like that. Having to deal with that yourself. Am I at fault? Like, that comes across in this movie. Am I at fault because of what happened to this guy that was fighting alongside me? It's it's an interesting film in that sense. And I know, like, I've been reading some of the reviews online since I've watched the film, and I read their reviews and I hear them say things like, oh, there's no epic moments in this movie, or it doesn't feel real. I think the opposite. I think this movie is so realistic, and that's what people can't come to grips with on this movie, because they expect everything to look like a Steven Spielberg war production, or they expect it to be something like a Michael Bay film where there's bombs going off every minute and things like that. This film, though, tells more the story of what it was actually like. You're in a trench for 200, 300 days, and sometimes you might go a whole week without seeing any action. There's a part in this movie where one of the characters almost says to one of the guys, "Can you give my guys more stuff to do?" Like, they're getting themselves in trouble, and they're developing a bit of an attitude because they're almost bored, in a sense. And that's not something that you think of when you think of war. I also take my hat off to a few people for their portrayals in this film as well. I think Miles Pollard steals the show as Sergeant Beaufort. He is amazing in this. He's kind of this guy that wants to be there for these guys, but he knows he has to push them in order if they want to survive. I think Levi Miller does a great job with this film as well. But I think the thing that's most exciting for me out of this movie is the career of Jordan Prince Wright. This is a guy who has basically shown for a long while that that he's got a lot to show. From the fact he was selected as the Young Australian Filmmaker of the Year back in 2014. He's worked on some pretty big films since then as well. Which I really think has helped him along the way. Like, he's worked on movies like Oddball, he worked on Red Dog, True Blue, so he's been working with top directors like Chris Stenders and people like that, and learning their craft. He worked on The Greatest Showman, and I think that's all coming out now in this movie. He's making a stamp, making a name for himself, and stamping his own kind of style on this movie, but you can kind of tell at the same stage that he's been working with some of the top people when it comes to talent here in Australia. So I think that's the exciting thing about this movie. But seeing a young director that I think is going to have a big future probably ahead of him in America, doing so well with an Australian film. But I also think this is a great film for reflection. If you want to go and see what daily life was like in the trenches for our diggers, then this is the perfect movie to go and watch. It doesn't sensationalize things. It doesn't need epic stunts and things like that to work as a movie. This is a character-driven war film that shows what the average Joe Blow here in Australia went through when they went to war. So definitely go and check out Before Dawn. I think this is a pretty good film. Don't go into this expecting a big Michael Bay epic war film like it feels like some people have, because I think Before Dawn is more the kind of movie that helps you reflect on what happens when you go to war. So I am going to give this one 3.5 out of 5. I think it's a very decent film to sit down and watch if you want to experience what it is like for someone to go to war day in and day out. So 3.5 out of 5, and check your local cinema guide to see if Before Dawn is screening somewhere near you.